One way to improve your timing on this section is to actually improve the way you're reading. You can read more effectively, more efficiently, and this can really affect your timing on this section. There's information in each passage that you should read very closely. That's going to be information that's really important to your understanding of the passage overall, or is likely to come up in the questions. And then there's a lot of other information that you can read quickly through. It's less important, it's details, it's probably not going to be asked in the questions, or if it does, you can easily refer back to the passage to answer that question. So learning how to identify these two different types of information in each passage can really affect your timing. If you start to figure out what information is important, you can read especially closely to that information and file it away in your head, and then you can use less brain power and less time to read through other information. And this is something that really happens over time as you practice a lot of reading passages. It's not going to happen overnight, but if you take the time to work through passages and you utilize this strategy, over some time, this can really affect your timing on this section. So let's take a look at a few examples of some things that would be important to read closely. But that explanation can't account for the way asteroids usually enter the Earth's atmosphere. So here, this is important because of the first word in the sentence, but this transition word tells us that the author is about to make a counterpoint, or they're pivoting their argument in the passage. And so this is very important to read closely. There's oftentimes questions that involve pivot points like this, and if you skimmed over this, you might miss an important turning point in the passage. So that would be very important. Let's look at another one. In this example, we have a clarifying point. It wasn't that she didn't love her husband. He had always been the consummate gentleman. It was simply that there was no room for her next to such a giant. Okay, so in this case, the author is clarifying something. They're telling us what they really mean, or what they're really thinking here. And that's very important. If we skim over clarifications, we often miss the real intentions of the author. And this could very easily come up in the questions, asking us what the author's true feelings are, or maybe what the meaning of giant really is. And if we don't read this closely, we could misunderstand the author here. So that's very important to read closely. Let's look at one more example. Human babies are remarkably helpless. Many parents claim that teenagers aren't much different, but the amount of development that happens, ... Okay, so here we don't have details yet, but we have a really nice setup from the author. And this is something else that's really important to read closely. If you have this setup either at the beginning of the passage or maybe a transition point in the passage, it's very important to read this closely because it can give you a real idea of what's to come and really what the overall passage is going to be about. So that's something else that you should focus on reading closely. Now let's take a look at a few examples of things that we could read through quickly. In this example, we have a couple dates and statistics. So it says, according to the research Winthrop reviewed, that trend continued with a 58% drop in 2012 and a 39% drop in 2013. So it's not that this drop couldn't be important, it might actually be. But what's more likely to happen is they ask you specifics about the drop. And that's something you can easily refer back to the passage, right? We don't need to memorize that there's a 39% drop in 2013. So when you see things like this that have dates and statistics, we can probably just skim right through this and make a little mental note of where that is in the passage. Or just put a star by it or something like that. That way, when you have a question that refers to details, you can refer back to the passage and answer your question. It's not something we need to spend a lot of time reading in detail and trying to remember. In some ways, this is an open book test, right? We can go back to the passage and find this information. We don't have to use brain space to just remember these dates and statistics. Let's take a look at another example. In this example, we have some details of a situation that's unfolding, right? Colin stumbled through the house and up the stairs into his room. He collapsed on his bed, exhausted. Okay, so while this detail makes the passage probably more interesting or the story more fun to read, it's not necessarily super important on the test that you read this in detail. If there were a specific question about the details of these events, you could find it in the passage. But for the most part, what's going to be important here is just that Colin is tired, right? That's enough detail for questions on the test. So don't focus on reading details like this in too much detail, focus on the overall idea, and that should save you some time here. So remember, this isn't going to happen overnight. You need to spend some real time in practice tests on the reading section. Work through the passages, time yourself as much as you can, and try to focus on what information you need to read closely and what information you can read through quickly. And this should really improve your reading timing.